So I'll just begin by explaining a bit about what the session will be on today. So Daughters of Charity Services became aware through communicating with our care services and the wider sector that care organisations are under immense strain. In particular, many are facing ongoing issues with staff recruitment and retention. So and it was also evident that many carers across the UK are putting themselves, or sorry, are struggling themselves with the cost of living, despite the long hours they put in and care organisations' best efforts to support the staff. Therefore, we wanted to better understand the exact challenges in the sector and the causes of these issues so that we could determine strategies for overcoming them and achieve a fair solution for everyone in the sector, including carers, the people they support, and the care organisations themselves. So to do this, we developed a social care survey, which we sent out to thousands of care organisations across the country. So I'm going to hand over to Dakota now, who will tell you a bit more about how we did that and reveal some of the key findings we collected from the survey.
Thanks, Rihanna. I'm going to share my screen. Let me know if for some reason you can't see this. Yeah, so I've sort of titled this Searching for Consensus for reasons that I hope will become clear over the course of the next few slides, but just bear with me that this is technically a bit of a working title. This is not going to be the final title, I'm sure, once the full report is published. But I wanted to make a few preliminary comments about what we're presenting here today. So these are preliminary findings from the initial survey responses that we collected, as well as some explanations and potentially indicative findings, I guess really implications from the preliminary findings that we're working with today. But a much more detailed and extensive analysis should be coming in the following months. Really, we're only scratching the surface here with this presentation, but we wanted to give you a bit of a flavor of what to expect from the rest of it, and hopefully to get you interested in the work and to start discussing it. But really, we're focusing on only 8 out of what is more than 40 questions worth of survey, and we're looking at it in a relatively uncomplex way, using some pretty simple data visualizations. We haven't applied really complex models to this. I'm hoping that will make the presentation a bit more accessible as well, but hopefully it remains interesting and we all get something from this. So just to provide a little bit of context about the research, and I know that most of you who have been to one of our previous presentations about this project will have already heard a lot of this information. But just so that everybody's on the same page, we already know that from other research that has been done by other organizations that carers are really struggling in a lot of ways. Particularly, they struggle with low pay for very difficult work, and they often don't get recognized for the work that they do. And so we also know that social care organizations themselves really struggle with finances and recruitment and retention, probably as a result of not having lots of cash that they can throw at the problem in front of them. And this sort of gives a perception of a sector that's in perpetual crisis. And we kind of wanted to help contribute to the conversation around how to solve this by digging a little bit deeper into the organizational perspectives that exist within the sector. Now, the survey covers quite a lot of topics. It's not just about what we're presenting today, as I've said before, but really what we're focusing on here is the perceptions that social care organizations have of the possible solutions going forward, especially looking at government policy and what government can do to help the sector. And so we're looking at both the perspective of the organizations themselves, but also we're trying to identify how much consensus there is amongst organizations with respect to the government policies that are on the table. And as just a point of background, we've framed most of the questions that we're presenting here today in the context of the autumn statement from last year. So there, the government announced up to £7.5 billion worth of additional funding for the social care sector through the end of fiscal year ending 2025. There's a lot of detail in their policy announcement, which I'll try to explain as it becomes relevant throughout the presentation. But really, this is the policy that's sort of contextualizing the rest of the questions that we asked. Now, the timeline that Rihanna and I have been working on with this, so last year, we started really formulating an idea of the project, and we started to think about where we can sort of contribute to the discussion. But the work really began in earnest in spring of this year. So that's when we started to develop the survey questions, as well as do research about what other organizations have already done. And we started collecting contacts from a registry of a CQC registry of social care locations throughout England. And then once we had compiled this contact list, we distributed the survey via email to more than 3,000 of them, as well as sending follow-up emails to try to boost responses. And this took place throughout pretty much mid-June to mid-August. And then since that the collection of responses ended in mid-August, we've been working on the analysis. And what I'm presenting here today is a selection of what we have so far, but of course this will continue for probably at least a few more months in terms of fleshing out all of the findings from the report. Now, we ended up with a final sample of 139 quality responses after filtering out a few that were, either clearly the same person responding twice, or, somebody had responded and but they only spent 10 seconds on the entire survey, not the kind of response that you want. So after filtering all of that out, we ended up with 139 analyzable responses, which is the sample that we're presenting responses for here today. So just to preview where we're going with this, there are three key findings that are sort of indicated or suggested to us by what I'm presenting here. The first one is that there's very broad consensus throughout the sector that more government funding is both good and necessary for solving the sector's problems. The second key finding is that organizations that have struggled in the past tend to be more pessimistic about their ability to solve their problems without government support in the future. This will have kind of particular policy consequences when thinking about this. I won't go into that now because this is just a preview, but just keep these in mind as we're going through. And then the third key finding is that there's possibly a credibility gap that's visible between the government's policies and the sector. And bridging this credibility gap is going to be really important, regardless of which party ends up winning the general election next year. And this is probably the one that I want to focus on the most. Now, you're going to have to bear with me because I'm about to bombard you with quite a lot of graphs, and I hope that you will stick with it. Yeah, I think Zoom has now implemented the ability to react with slow down or speed up. So feel free to use that new feature as you feel is appropriate here. So this graph here isn't one of the questions that we asked, or at least it's not one of the questions that I'm going to be focusing on substantively here. But I'm just showing this because we wanted to get an organizational perspective with this research. And so we were really targeting managers and executives at care organizations to get their view, because we reasoned that they would have the deepest and perhaps broadest as well opinion of what's going on with an organization, and how likely they are to weather certain issues in the future. And this graph is really indicating to us that our targeting was successful. So just about every single person who responded to this survey was either a CEO or executive level in their organization, or a manager, which means that we're pretty confident that this is coming from people who have a good understanding of the organization. There are about 5% of responses coming from other other roles within an organization. So I included these primarily because each of these respondents also indicated they had quite a lot of experience with their org. So just as an example, there was a personal assistant to an executive who wasn't explicitly in our target population here, but they indicated that they had more than 10 years experience in their role. And so I felt it was appropriate to keep them as they met the criteria um, uh, of having a broad and deep understanding of what's going on in the organization. This is more of just a technical point, but I felt it appropriate to bring up. But now let's actually get into some of the questions that we were asking on a more substantive level. So essentially what you want to be looking at here on these graphs is the title, which is directly above the graph. So the additional funding will meaningfully help the problems facing the adult social care sector. So this is the statement that we were wanting the respondents to agree or disagree with, or neither with. And we had a series of these statements and collected responses from each of the organizations. So the graphs here are for all respondents in our survey, but later on we'll break it down by a few organizational characteristics to get at some differences there. So just looking at the substance of this question, the additional funding will meaningfully help the problems facing the adult social care sector. Really here, we can see that there's quite a wide range of opinion about how strongly they agree or disagree with this question. So more than 20% strongly disagreed that the additional funding announced in the autumn statement will meaningfully help the problems. And that's quite interesting. But if you look at it in the context of the entire graph, we can see that more or less the same number of respondents either disagreed or agreed with the statement. And so there's not a lot of unanimity in terms of the response here. I think there's a little bit more, there are a few more organizations who agree with this statement, but it's sort of offset by the fact that the sentiment is somewhat stronger for those who disagree with the statement. So just looking at this graph alone, there's not necessarily a lot that we can take other than that there's quite a lot of uncertainty, a lot of disagreement about how impactful the funding will actually be. But not otherwise, there's not that much that we can take from this graph alone. But in context of the other graphs that I'm about to present, hopefully we can. I should also note that the gray bar in the middle, expressing neutral opinion, is essentially saying I neither agree nor disagree. But interpreting this is a little bit tricky because there are multiple reasons that somebody might give for responding this way. So one way to interpret the gray bar is that it indicates uncertainty. So a respondent may feel that they actually just don't know the answer, or they don't know how they feel about the statement. But it could be that they do know how they feel about the statement, but that our question isn't getting at the things that they're thinking about, right? And it's not clear which of these possibilities is happening here. I might refer to the gray bar as uncertainty, but just know that there are other possible interpretations there. Right. So here, not a lot of agreement. However, when we talk about, or when we ask about whether in the abstract, it was a good decision to increase funding for adult social care, this is a very high level question. It's not really getting at anything specific. We see pretty much overwhelming support. So more than 80% of respondents are saying that it was a good idea to increase funding for the adult social care sector. And if we ask the question in a slightly different way, slightly more, a bit more meat on this question, we see a very similar story. So to really solve the biggest problems in the sector, the government will need to increase funding for adult social care even more. And remember that this is in the context of the 7.5 billion funding that was announced last fall. So asking the question in this way is probably the way that I prefer to think about, because it gets at a few of the more interesting underlying policy questions. It, in particular, um, the first part of the statement, to really solve the biggest problems in the sector, that part sort of implies that there could be other things that the government could do, but that they may not be sufficient for solving the problem. And the response here, being overwhelmingly in agreement with the statement, seems to suggest to us that organizations don't feel that around the edges solutions will really fix the problems. So notably, more than 50% of respondents here strongly agreed with this statement. And if we compare that with before, where roughly or maybe less than 40% strongly agreed in the abstract, when you ask the slightly more specific question, the sentiment becomes even stronger for those who agree. And I find that quite interesting. I think that indicates to us that it really is about funding here, and it's not about some other issue being fundamental. So we got not a lot of agreement on whether it would help the sector, but we do have a lot of agreement that it's a good idea to increase funding, and that funding will be necessary. But we can also ask about how the funding will affect organizations on an individual basis. So not thinking about the entire sector here, we're thinking about the organizations who are responding now. Here we asked, the additional funding will make a noticeable positive difference for my organization. And here we see quite a bit more pessimism than we've seen in the past few questions. So roughly 40% disagreed with this statement explicitly, which clearly outnumbers the number that agree or strongly agree. But still, there's a good variety of opinion. It's not overwhelmingly falling in one direction or the other, but there is more pessimism here. And this is quite interesting, because if organizations are saying that if organizations are less confident that the funding will actually benefit them as an organization than they are that it will benefit the sector as a whole, this kind of speaks to them not believing that they are either the primary targets of the policy, or that the policy just won't reach them for some reason or another. And I'll get into some of that in a little bit. Let me finish up these graphs, and then we can discuss why this difference might be emerging a little bit. So the next question is also about the individual level for the organizations. So without increased government funding, my organization will still find a way to adequately recruit carers. So we know that recruitment and retention, but especially recruitment, have been really, really big problems for most social care organizations in recent history. And so this question I found quite interesting to look at the response, because it was significantly more optimistic than I had originally anticipated. Even though there's not a lot of consensus, and the largest single response is the neutral response still, I was expecting there to be quite a bit more red on this screen when I made this graph than there actually was. And that's quite interesting. Organizations are more confident that they'll be able to recruit without government funding. But there's an interesting question when we look at the next graph, which is, without increased government funding, my organization will still find a way to increase pay for carers. Here, there's a lot more pessimism being expressed than in the previous question, right? We now have, again, a bit more than 40% of respondents saying that they don't think they'll be able to increase pay. And I've written that this is perhaps a little bit of a puzzle that we need to solve. Organizations are more confident that they can recruit than they are that they can increase pay, but we know that increasing pay is one of the main things that drives easing recruitment difficulties. And given various macroeconomic circumstances right now, with a stagnating economy, high inflation, it's not 100% clear to me that this is entirely consistent. But we just have to take it at at face value at the moment. I should also note that if we ask about confidence in terms of or the ability of an organization to recruit retain carers without increased government funding, the results are pretty much the same, just a little bit more pronounced, but I haven't included that slide here. Now, lastly, we asked about whether organizations would be able to improve carers' working conditions without increased government funding. And here, probably unsurprisingly, we see more confidence. I say probably unsurprisingly because improving working conditions doesn't necessarily require increasing pay, or it doesn't require increasing the funding available for social care organizations. There are theoretically other things that organizations can do to improve their working conditions. So this isn't necessarily the most surprising thing. I guess the main thing, though, that I want you all to pick up from these graphs. Okay, so we're gonna just halt there because that was a lot of information, and I feel like I've been speaking at 50 miles an hour. But if we just pause and think about what we're supposed to be taking from these graphs. So firstly, we're not seeing a lot of consensus on most of these questions, right? So there seems to be quite a diversity of opinion about how the increased government funding is going to affect organizations on an individual basis. But there's also not a lot of agreement about how it will affect the sector as a whole. But we are seeing that there's a lot of consensus with respect to oh, sorry. I think you're unmuted, Angela. Yeah. So even though we're not seeing much consensus in terms of most of the questions here, we are seeing quite a lot of consensus when it comes to the sort of macro level perspective about funding. So most organizations are very confident that additional funding will be necessary to solve the sector's problems. And most of them also are very confident that it is a necessary solution, and that other solutions won't be fully viable. Now, we might ask here whether we're not seeing much consensus on a lot of these questions because organizational characteristics are determining what is causing organizational characteristics are causing some organizations to disagree with these statements and other organizations to agree. So, for example, what we're going to look at in a second is whether an organization's past experience with retention is predictive of whether they are likely to disagree with these statements or agree and therefore express pessimism or optimism. There are lots of different ways that you could break down these questions. You could break it down by where an organization is getting their clients from primarily, so local authorities or private patients or clients. You could also break it down by organizational size. There are many different ways that you could do this, and they might give you different answers. I'm just going to focus on experience with retention difficulty. The reason that I focus on retention as opposed to recruitment is basically because of this graph here that I'm showing you. So pretty much every single organization in the sample, with a few exceptions, responded that they were having a difficult or very difficult time with recruitment. This wasn't a particularly surprising result, although maybe the magnitude of the result was kind of surprising. I think here the fact that there's a very large group saying they neither found it difficult nor easy is interesting. I think it's very unlikely that an organization would generally describe their experience as easy or very easy. And I think that's clear from this graph. So because there's not really very much difference in terms of how respondents responded to this particular question, I instead focus on difficulty with retention because there's a bit more of a variety of responses here. The group saying that they found retention relatively easy was much larger than it was for the recruitment question. And so I'm going to break down all of the questions that we looked at before by the easy group is what I'm going to call them, meaning they responded that retention was easy, and difficult group, meaning they said retention was difficult. Okay, so just keep those two groups in mind as we go forward. So here we're looking at the first question that we presented for the additional funding will meaningfully help the problems facing the adult social care sector. And we're comparing on the left, the easy group, with the right, difficult group. With this graph, it's not necessarily the easiest thing to tell, but really these are more or less the same numbers responding that they disagree or agree between both groups. So the direction of opinion isn't very different here, but we can see that among the difficult group, they're expressing stronger opinions than the easy group. This means that they have stronger opinions about the statement, and that's not necessarily surprising because the organizations respond in the difficult group are also the ones who probably have a bit more skin in the game. You know, they're in a bit more precarious positions when it comes to their financial and recruitment and retention circumstances. So when you're in a stressful situation, you're probably more likely to give a strong or have a strong opinion about those circumstances and about the plight of the sector as well. So I think that's why we're seeing the different strengths here. But overall, the main point of this is that the groups aren't differing that much when asked this question. And then going back to that very big level, is it a good idea to increase funding? Both groups also broadly agree with this. There's not a huge difference between them, although it's notable that the easy group is more likely to strongly disagree with the statement. So they're more likely to not to think it was not necessarily a bad idea, but not think it was a good idea to increase funding for social care than the difficult group. But also they're more likely to respond neutrally as well. But the key point here is really just that the overall agreement with the statement is very high for both groups. And when we ask the question in the other way, in the slightly more interesting way, we see this pretty much the same pattern that we saw when we didn't break the groups apart. So both easy and difficult groups found that or strongly agreed with this statement. And we see that the strength of that opinion, I'm just flicking back and forth between the previous question and this one. The strength of that opinion is going up pretty considerably when we ask it in this more specific way. So again, this is indicating that finances are really the solution to the problem in the eyes of these organizations. It's not something besides finances. Now, when we start asking about the individual level circumstances of the organizations and how they'll respond to having more funding, we again see quite a lot of disagreement in both groups. These are pretty similar graphs. There's not a major difference from an analytical perspective here. So not a lot going on here, pretty much the same story we had before. But we do start to see some more noticeable differences when we ask some of these other questions. So without increased government funding, my organization will still find a way to adequately recruit carers. In general, the group that had an easy time with retention is also expressing quite a lot of optimism about their ability to adequately recruit carers here. I find this quite interesting because most of these organizations also said that they had a difficult time with recruitment in the past. And so it's quite interesting that they're confident that they'll be able to adequately recruit carers going forward without funding. But nevertheless, the key insight here is that they are responding quite differently than the organizations that are in the difficult group. So the difficult group doesn't seem to think that they're going to be able to adequately recruit carers without more government funding. Although we should note that there's a lot of neutral sentiment expressed here as well. So almost half of the difficult group is responding neutrally. But essentially, the story here, different levels of optimism between the groups. Asking instead about increasing pay for carers, we see more or less the same story, but now both groups are a little bit more pessimistic than they were for the other question, except now we really see that that the difficult group is not confident at all that they're going to be able to increase pay for carers. And if we consider uh, recruitment again as being downstream primarily of pay, then this puzzle that we identified earlier is present here a little bit again. They're less confident that they can increase pay than they are that they'll be able to recruit, but it's not clear that recruitment difficulties will improve without pay, if you see what I mean. And then lastly, we also broke down the final question about working conditions by group here. And again, we just have the same kind of story that we're seeing elsewhere. So the easy group is finding it, is expressing much more confidence here, whereas the difficult group is much more pessimistic. So let's pause again. And I don't have any more graphs for you, so you can relax a little bit. So what are we being told here overall when we consider all of these graphs together? So first of all, organizations seem to be expressing opinions about government policy based on based on sectoral issues rather than their own personal circumstances. What I mean by that is when you ask organizations about the broader sector, their personal circumstances don't seem to be influencing their assessments there, which gives me a little bit more confidence that the implications we're deriving from the macro level questions are actually indicative of a more objective answer to the question than otherwise might be the case. So the way I've worded it here is organizations aren't assessing government's policy merits based on their own circumstances with retention. Secondly, regardless of what the experience of the organization is in terms of retention, nobody seems to have much confidence that the current commitments of funding are enough. Just about everybody said that more funding is going to be necessary above and beyond what has already been promised. And there's pretty much universal agreement, regardless of how you break down the groups, that more funding is both good and necessary for solving the problems. And then thirdly, when you do ask organizations about their individual circumstances and their own experiences, differences do start to emerge based on their past experiences. So they are assessing their personal circumstances based on their past experiences, which is I suppose what you'd expect. But really, from a policy perspective, organizations that have struggled more in the past expect to struggle more in the future. And this sort of speaks to the credibility gap that I was talking about before. The organizations that are struggling, if you were running an effective public policy on this, you would want them to feel confident that they're going to receive the help that they need from your policies. But that's not showing up here in our responses. We're seeing that there's a major lack of confidence, and clearly the funding commitments that have been proposed so far aren't inspiring the sector, particularly those who have struggled in the past, to have a bit more optimism about the future. And I think this is really important for policymakers to think about. I mean, more than just creating an environment where there is more funding for the social care organizations, it's really important to create a policy that clearly communicates and credibly makes the case that there, in fact, will be more funding for social care, the social care sector, which is really the third point. So I sort of did this on the previous slide, but just recapping what the key takeaways here are. There's very broad consensus that more government funding is good and necessary. Organizations that have struggled in the past lack confidence that they can solve their problems without government support. And thirdly, there's possibly a credibility gap between government policy and the sector, and it's going to be really important for the next administration to bridge that credibility gap and make it clear to organizations that they can rely on the government for help. So that's basically the preliminary findings that we have up to this point. Like I said, there's going to be quite a lot more coming in the following months, much more detail, much more thorough analysis, but I guess I should move on to the Q&A because I've used up quite a lot of the session. If anybody has any questions.
Anne Redmond?
When you talked about social care, were you looking at domiciliary care and or care home social care?
We looked at both.
Okay.
So we did ask respondents to indicate their primary type of service. So we had domiciliary care, we had care home without nursing, care home with nursing, and then other. I don't remember off the top of my head what the breakdown was. I think it was roughly 45% domiciliary care, about 45% care home, either category, and then about 10% other. And you could run all of these questions broken down by the type of service. I just haven't done that here.
Can I ask just a second question? Did you ask at all about in the domiciliary sector about contracts, nil-hour contracts versus actually being employed over a length of time? Did you look at that issue?
Yes, we also asked how many of the what proportion of carers are on permanent contracts versus non-permanent contracts. I haven't broken that down yet, so I'm not ready to necessarily speak about how that is in play here, but yes, that is in the survey.
I kind of feel that going forward, that's the big issue, that, you know, if people are on these nil-hour contracts, then it's very difficult to attract to the sector. And in a sense, they're being discriminated because everybody else has got full contracts, and carers who have got possibly the most challenging work in the domiciliary sector are the ones that are kind of like we're against them. We're not giving them proper contracts.
Yeah, definitely.
Were you heading towards looking at that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the survey asked a pretty broad range of questions. So it asked about the permanent contracts issue that you're bringing up. It asked about part-time work versus full-time work. It asked about international recruitment in various ways. I mean, quite a broad range. And so while I wish I was able to talk a bit more about that today, I think you'll have to wait for the full report for those findings.
Okay, thank you.
Dakota, should we take down the share screen so we can see everyone?
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's fine. Andrew.
Okay, good morning, everybody. First of all, I found it really interesting, Dakota, and look forward to seeing the rest of the survey. So thank you for that. The first thought that came into my head was about the beginning of the survey and what the response was to this new group going to organisations with surveys, whether there was a response at all, or whether people just accepted it. So just very curious about that.
Well, I mean, there wasn't really much of a response except for the fact that they responded to the survey. If you're getting at some other response, I'm not sure, but
I suppose
you know,
I wondered what people thought who were DC services? Why were they asking us these questions? Whether there were any things around that, really, as it's a fairly new venture.
Yeah. So if there was response in that, if there was questioning about that, they certainly didn't flag that with us. I think I received one email out of the thousands of organizations we contacted where they said, what is, tell me more about your organization. What is the purpose of this survey? For the most part, we just didn't really hear much about that. And as far as the response rates go for this, we sent a bit over 3,000. We contacted a bit more than 3,000 organizations, and I think about 200 before we filtered out responses. 200 responded, which, as far as these surveys go, is a relatively good response rate. Caring, I think earlier this year in March, also ran a survey of social care organizations. Obviously, they're a much larger organization than we are, but we ended up getting pretty much the same response rate as they did, which I was quite encouraged by.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
I'd also say when we sent out the survey, it was done via email, so we were contacting them personally, and we did explain in the email who we were and why we were doing the survey, and we just kept reiterating that if they respond to this, it's in their best interest. It's to help them. It's not for just our own interest, because we are looking to advocate to make things better. So I think we really didn't get many emails back, questioning what it was about or why. It was quite clear, I think, in the email, and then particularly once we did the follow-up email as well, they kind of got used to us contacting them, and we didn't really get, surprisingly, I thought we would get some more as well questions, but we didn't. So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Candice.
The organisations did say that the funding would be a good idea, but I was wondering, was there any indication of what they would use the funding for, other than just raising salaries?
So we didn't ask questions getting at what they would use funds for. So I'm not able to really answer that. But just based on what organizations have generally expressed difficulty with, I would assume it would primarily go for recruiting and retaining staff. Although, I'd say it's reasonable to not assume that if you didn't want to. But we unfortunately can't really answer that in more detail.
Okay.
Any more questions at all?
Can I just make a comment?
Yes.
Sorry,
Yeah.
you can't see me there. I worked as a carer for several years, and it didn't surprise me that there was such diversity in the opinions held on the survey, because carers as a whole don't have a collective voice. As we know, they don't take industrial action, and they're not unionized usually. And this is because they work as individuals, or at most in pairs, and it is very hard for them to what shall I say, to progress in any meaningful way professionally from what they do. They know that if they withhold their service, the people they're caring for, who they do have good relationships and close relationships very often, they won't be served. And so they can't withdraw their service in that way. A lot of them wouldn't do it morally. So that didn't surprise me. I was just wondering who commissioned the survey and how will it be used effectively in the future? Thank you.
Sure. So I guess just about the comment before I answer the question, I just want to be clear that we were surveying primarily managers and executives within these organizations, not the frontline carers. I don't know if that changes how you're thinking about this at all, but I just wanted to
No, because
re-emphasize that.
The managers know the situation of the carers, and a lot of them have been carers themselves.
Yeah, definitely. I just wanted to sort of make sure that was clear in case anybody was confused. But as far as your question goes, who commissioned the survey? Basically us. So we've done everything for this survey. It wasn't brought in by an outside organization. However, we initially sort of formulated the idea with the Vincentian advocacy group, which is a collection of different Vincentian organizations, but the work happened within Daughters of Charity Services. As far as how it's going to be used in the future effectively, we are sort of in the process of developing a bit more detailed advocacy work plan. So this is my last day working for Daughters of Charity Services. There's another person coming in after me, and we're hoping that with them and Rihanna will sort of flesh that out a little bit more. But I think the target audience is primarily government officials, political parties, that as we're gearing up for general election, industry leaders. Yeah, but as far as the specifics go, I don't want to say too much because I won't be the one doing it.
I'm happy to jump in on
Thank
this
you.
one. So just briefly, in terms of where it was commissioned, it was born out of countless conversations when we're talking around the projects across the group of, isn't the care sector in crisis? Someone ought to do something about this. And it was a case of, well, let's put some solid evidence, as well as drawing on the experience of 3 organizations. We can see kind of a sector-wide view of exactly what the problem is. And in terms of where we're going with it, as Dakota said, we're really keen. This is the first big piece of research that we've done. It's a little different to how we've worked previously, and the idea is that at some point we'll be able to write it up into a full report and then use that as a mechanism, as a tool through which we can hopefully attract, as Dakota said, maybe some MPs or lords or baronesses, key legislators who can help to kind of enable our voice to be heard a little bit further and maybe carry a little weight into discussions that are taking place at a government level, or what should be happening with the sector. So we're hoping that by producing a kind of fully fledged report that goes with it, we can use it as a chance to bring people on board and say, well, this is a snapshot of what we found that builds on the experience of our own charities, and this is why we are calling for change in XYZ. So it's different to what we've done before, but we feel it's quite an exciting, quite a necessary opportunity as well.
Thank you.
Any other questions at all? Sister Ellen?
Yeah, I'm just going backwards a little bit into Anne's comments. I would want to add to them the injustice that carers are required to finance their own travel between one client and the other and not be paid for that time. So I hope that's somewhere in the survey. I'm
happy to say that it is. We did ask about that.
That's fundamentally unjust. And also, but my experience of trying to actually work with one of our organizations around 0-hour contracts was that the carers themselves wanted them because it gave them the flexibility. So I think you're going to get mixed responses to that question, because it really suited some of the carers to work the hours they wanted to work and not to have contracted hours. So I think that's, we all feel it's unjust that people don't have contracts, but sometimes it's their choice. So that's going to be an interesting thing, I think, to tease out as the survey goes on. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.